Sabrina 90s comic, issue 31. Hilda asks Sabrina if she's going out because she needs some vegetables. Why doesn't she zap them up for free herself? Sabrina agrees and asks Salem if he wants to go for a ride, and he agrees and calls her Miss Daisy for some reason. Sabrina actually drives in the old-fashioned car again. I love that the comic actually remembered it. She says that now she thinks her 1922 car is cool, so then why hasn't she taken it out in a while? She probably wants to avoid teasing from people who don't think it's cool. Sabrina says that the best fresh veggies are at the stand in front of Conover's farm, so the comic's remembering that she prefers fresh veggies to eat. It was off-putting just how black-colored that road was. It must have been just repainted. A speeding truck comes barreling over the hill and keeps honking, and Salem says he ought to zap. Then it turns out he used the magic he somehow kept to change the elements in his gas tank from fuel to hot air. Sabrina actually appreciates what he did, saying that that'll give him time to cool down. And he'll call for help with his radio anyways. That won't make him stop speeding though. But it probably prevented a car accident for the short term. Sabrina gets to the veggie stand, and suddenly that truck from earlier swerves towards them and blows down half of the veggie stand, with Salem justifying that he must have had spare gas. Oh, I guess he wasn't intentionally targeting Sabrina. How could he know one of the people in her car was at fault? The veggie salesman naturally wants to call the police, and Sabrina says she's got to go after that man and get him off the road. Sabrina pulls the flying knob of the car, with Salem congratulating her for it. The trucker says that he doesn't recall turning towards the Black Hills, and then he sees a giant version of Salem, and says that he must be hallucinating from too many sleepless nights and too much coffee. He says he's got to get out of here fast, and Salem amused me by telling him, "Remember, objects in the mirror are closer than they appear." Obviously, scaring him just made him drive even more recklessly, which would increase the risk of him hurting someone else. Sabrina may be bothering someone, but she's accomplishing good by doing so, so she's both a hero and abusing her powers. Ultimately, it evens out to her being a well-intentioned anti-hero extremist. It's certainly better to read than her being restricted and nagged at. You'd expect a witch to have a story like this. She says that because no one is safe with him on the road, she has to increase his workload by multiplying his cargo's density 100-fold, getting the truck to sink in the street. You'd think he'd get suspicious. You'd think everyone would realize he was magical. She'd have to immediately undo her cargo density spell after that. Later on, a cop tells Sabrina that a crane is on its way to yank the truck out, and the trucker's actually wanted in 3 states, but won't be doing any driving for a while. It's good that this was explained, so it makes it feel more justified that Sabrina went out of her way to bother him, because it's not like this is the only time he's ever done any speeding. He's actually done this a lot, so he's long overdue to get caught. Then the cop has a sense of humor, ending the story with a pun about disturbing the peas. In the next story, Hilda screams on her way to the shower and says that there's a young man she doesn't know in her bathroom, even though she's a witch, so she could just use magic immediately on him, not need someone's help. Sabrina plans on calling 911 instead of simply freezing him in place with her magic, but then he reveals he knows Hilda's name and tells her to wait. Because he knows Hilda, this justifies Salem talking in front of her. He says that he should call her by her proper title, Lady Hildegard. Hilda's fed up with this for some reason when she should recognize the name and ask for the phone. Salem thinks he's familiar, even though he's been with Hilda so recently that she just found out what he looked like in his human form at the start of the comic. He magically gives her roses, and then tries to refresh her memory by appearing as he did at their last meeting. It reminds her of the party for Sir Galahad, as he has a very stereotypical cliché wizard hat and beard. At least the clichéness is justified because he's literally Merlin. Archie Sonic was more creative because Merlin was just a name, and not literally meant to be the same character as the guy from Camelot. As I wonder why he and Hilda stopped dating, Merlin explains that over the centuries he's gone by many names, and he escaped from his glass tower or whatever, and spent the last few centuries with the fairies. First off, I wish I was told how he escaped from the glass tower. Second, how was he imprisoned or shapeshifted anyways? It must have been by a more powerful witch, who robbed him of his powers temporarily, like Enchantra. Why would it be temporary? I guess he was enslaved by the fairies like Sabrina was once. Or maybe fairies and pixies are separate things in this comic. since Hilda didn't react with revulsion to this, and he was fine with saying it. Why does he still have his powers? They thought he deserved to be put in a glass tower. This whole story wouldn't happen. Merlin says out of nowhere that he actually gets younger as time goes by, which is why he looks Sabrina's age. But why? How? Won't he just stay the age he likes? It must be a curse placed on him by a witch, so powerful that he can't undo it. And yet they didn't curse him to look like a cat. Also, do wizards have a separate planet like the wizard world? It seems to be no big deal to anyone to hear that he's a wizard, not a warlock. I wonder if wizard and warlock are being treated as the exact same thing here. Because no one's elaborating on what the difference is. It is interesting that he gets younger, but I wish I knew why. Because it's not the case with witches. I have a hard time believing he was born an old man. He says that now that he's a teenager, he's decided to have fun spending time with mortals again. It'd only be fun if he was abusing his powers, enjoying being a big fish in a little pond. Because otherwise it wouldn't be fun because mortals can't do everything he can do. Hilda hopes he doesn't mean here. So why does Hilda hate him? She should explain herself. At least later, to Sabrina. Sabrina says that her friends already think she's weird without having to explain a wizard in her house. We haven't seen Emily since really early on after she must have figured out she was a witch. She completely dropped to the fact that she knew she was a witch. You'd think that would be tension, like her trying to expose her, and it should have been explained that her memory was wiped. Later on, after Zelda sees Merlin and is called a countess for some reason, she says she doesn't want Merlin staying here, and Zelda says that they have to because he's the most powerful wizard. And she hopes Sabrina of all people can teach him how to behave. Sabrina tells Zelda that things were going okay until she told him they played sports at her high school. So now Merlin wants to form a jousting team. Yeah, totally ignore the injury and death risk with that. Sabrina realistically says she has to clean up after his horse. Hilda tells Merlin to his surprise that he has to adapt to the modern world. Zelda tells him to learn a current sport like football. The next day at Westbridge High, Sabrina introduces Merlin to Harvey as Merle from Wales. He still speaks formally, and for some reason he immediately thinks Harvey's a sad specimen and turns him into a salamander because he reminds him of it, even though all Harvey did was say nice to meet you. Well, this is an awful character so far. I think Shrek 3 portrayed Merlin better. I feel like even Merlin from the original tale was better. Didn't he have a nervous breakdown from being sad that he had to fight in a war and went to live in the woods? And that was what Shrek 3 based him off of? Which meant he felt guilty about having to fight in a war. Which meant he's a better person than this Merlin. He wouldn't have cared. He says that young witches don't tell wizards what to do. So is he like this because he's sexist from being behind in the times, when you'd think things would have progressed in the other realm? Or is he revealing that wizards think they're better than witches when they're exactly like them? He's not even restricted to a wand. He didn't need a wand or have to move his arms around or snap his fingers. He just pointed. He didn't have to do anything differently to activate his magic. So it would be better to call him a witch, because he's not the real Merlin anyways, and it'd be creative, making him fit more in the Sabrina universe, because he's a witch. Mr. Kraft tells Sabrina to take that specimen back to the science lab at once. Kraft is starting to sound familiar now. Was he that jerk that dated Zelda in the sitcom? I think so, but the sitcom version had glasses, and less hair. No wonder I didn't recognize him at first. He's supposed to be balding. Sabrina tells Merle that he just got her in trouble with the vice principal, and asks why he turned Harvey into a salamander. Unfortunately, Kraft is confused as all hell. Merle says that it's the way he works, but that's not an explanation. Why does he think it's okay? A good character would explain his position on things. He says that if she'd taken Salem's advice and read up on him, like a smart person, she'd know he taught King Arthur lessons by turning him into animals. So he turns her into a bird with a human face for the most part, making the existence of magic immediately obvious to mortals. Why didn't anyone warn Sabrina about how Merle was a lot earlier? I guess Merlin is the head wizard, since he's the most powerful wizard, so he's allowed to make life harder for the spy witches who have to clean up after this. I can't believe this comic still hasn't explained that they're memory erasing witches keeping the masquerade up. A few people witnessing magic isn't a big deal because no one would ever believe them, but if it adds up enough, then most people would know about it. Sabrina realistically can't talk as a bird, and is shooed out the window. She has a human face, right? But she doesn't have the neck of a human, so of course she wouldn't have human vocal cords. They're trying to be realistic by not letting her talk, but then why does she have a human face? Kraft asks why there isn't a screen in this window, and then he asks Merle to step over here. He tells him to step into his office because they have certain rules at high school. For some reason, I remember Zelda's boyfriend, Mr. Kraft, way more vividly from the show than Harvey. At least they got the mustache right, but his hair isn't dark enough and his head isn't round enough. Why is he wearing a green jacket instead of a brown one? It just doesn't feel as much like Mr. Kraft if Zelda isn't dating him. And why did it suddenly become a white jacket in the next panel? I guess Merle changed his color on a whim and is messing with his memory to make him unable to question it. He's cavalier about magic in every other way. Sabrina wants to fly home to her aunts. Does she not know how to use telepathy? Her aunts can use telepathy, so why doesn't she just use telepathy herself? I guess she was too much of an idiot to think of it at the moment. Fortunately, she thinks it's exhilarating to fly, and she's glad she was made into a bird. Salem doesn't recognize her and goes after her, even though she clearly has hair and a face like Sabrina with only a beak to look different. If that was only there for the audience, it implies that the artist thought we'd be stupid enough to not know what Sabrina otherwise. Then that really sucks because it's just confusing. We weren't told that wasn't how she looked in universe. Apparently it is how she looks, because Hilda immediately recognizes her. So why didn't Salem? It turns out that Merle's magic is too strong for ants to turn her back into a human, and yet they can restore a voice. I guess it's just in his genes. I'm glad Salem awkwardly apologizes to her. And I love the continuity nod. Sabrina asks him if he learned anything from the pterodactyl incident. Continuity nods make me feel like the writers of this comic really cared, because normally it's episodic, so it doesn't have to reference anything. Sabrina tells her aunts that when Kraft was chasing him, Merle mentioned Castle Merlin. Why doesn't he say Merlin Castle instead? It's not French, where the adjective is after the noun. Salem's actually useful. The fact that he researched Merlin comes up again as a check his gun because he says he was in love with the Lady of the Lake, who I already knew is called Nemu because of Sonic and the Black Knight. I vaguely remember learning that the game mispronounced her name. You'd think that Hilda would know Merle better than anyone here since she actually knew him personally. But at least this is more interesting. Rather than them simply teleporting Nemu to her, Hilda calls on her near Cooper's Pond. I guess she thought it'd be rude to teleport it to her. After all, she could be in the bathroom for all she knew, so that would be against witch etiquette big time. But she should explain that. The reason they know Nemu's here is that she can be called forth from all water. Then why are they going to Cooper's Pond in particular? That's not as fast as just talking to a glass of water. And I'm immediately distracted and confused at Nemu's design, which shows off as much skin as she can get away with. And what's with her yellow hat? Why isn't she dressed like Amy from Sonic and the Black Knight? She looks more like she's from ancient Egypt. At least that's creative. She says that she already heard a rumor that Merle is back and asked him not to call him her boyfriend, because only he thought he was her boyfriend. That's interesting to read from her, since she was represented by Amy, Sonic's self-proclaimed girlfriend. It was nice of her to say please and not be mean to them. She tells Hilda to take a pint of this water to Merle so that he'll see her in there and get lovesick. Zelda says she's got the jar, and Hilda drives to Sabrina's school, which was turned into a castle surrounded by guards. He's changed the student body into spear-carrying soldiers and archers. You'd think this would be reported on. The spy witches are gonna have their hands full. Why isn't Enchantress stepping in? I guess she's terrified of Merlin. This problem was foreshadowed, especially since he wanted jousting and had to be told not to adapt the modern world to the medieval times. Sabrina says that she'd better fly the jar into the school. Why did Hilda say that her insurance won't cover that? Well, it's because the spear falls on the car. But can't she just magically undo the damage? So she shouldn't have said this at all. We see Kraft fanning Merle as he's dressed like a king. Merle's actually happy to see Sabrina. He sure forgave her fast, that's good. He sees the jar and sounds like a creep. Sabrina says that he can keep the jar if he turns everything back to normal. Why does he do the deal instead of just swatting her away or using magic on her? He said earlier that young witches shouldn't order wizards around. He sure was feeling generous that day. All because the story had to end early. I feel like the only reason it ended early was because it was the second story in the issue and not the first. But you'd die if you didn't humor her. Kraft then asked her what she's doing at his desk, with no one remembering what happened. And Hilda can somehow sense that Merle went to another dimension. I sure feel sorry for Nemu, but at least her not wanting him explains why I wasn't dating her before. In the next story, Sabrina asks Morton what's going on, and he complains that this is the last straw because Salem's been in his rose bushes again. He tells her to take her cat in this document, a notice to appear in court on the Judge Julia's show, as opposed to appearing in actual court. Well, that's weird and confusing. Zelda says she's seen that show, and the judge is playing up to the camera and mocking the legal system. I wish she elaborated on that, but she's probably right. It's probably the writer's opinion of Judge Judy, but then it should be elaborated on more to make its point come across better. Sabrina complains that a simple wire fence would have solved this. Then why didn't they magic one up a long time ago? Zelda says that she's been known to litigate every now and then. Salem says, like the Spanish Inquisition. Zelda's really overconfident, thinking she could be a good attorney when she would obviously be hopelessly out of date on how the law is now. Hilda says that every family has a dark secret, and we see the TV on, with the judge being ridiculously unprofessionally rude. And suddenly I'm glad it's going to be a court on a ridiculous TV show. Maybe that'll actually justify the court scene being ridiculously unrealistic then. Because every show on Earth portrays court and stuff wrong. Otherwise it wouldn't be dramatic. 1 week later. Just a week? Yeah, definitely a silly TV show. Is it even realistic that it'd take just a week for him to be summoned to the TV show? Zelda tells the judge that she's the legal guardian of Sabrina. Won't she be immediately told she can't be Sabrina's attorney because there'd be a conflict of interest? Some kind of bias because she knows the defendant personally? Also, Salem should be the defendant, not Sabrina, who didn't do anything wrong. I've never seen Judge Judy, so I sadly can't speak for how accurate this is being to that and say that the unrealisticness is justified because it's just being like the show. All I can do is point out how unlike an actual court this would be. She says that domesticated animal law goes back to the dawn of civilization, and says she'll quote the Code of Hammurabi. She's immediately told that this court obeys state and local law, and is told to quit wasting his time. And she fortunately tells him there's no need to be rude, and fortunately she's not punished for that. Zelda's an idiot again, and is threatened with being removed, as I wonder why she was allowed to be an attorney at all. Won't her law degree be really outdated? She's supposed to be a genius. That's one of her main character traits. She was a science teacher in the show. I don't know why they don't go with that. She fortunately wisens up and uses magic, which causes Morton to insult the judge for being bald. Sabrina was right. A simple fence could have solved his cat problem. So while Morton would be in the right here, having a relatable problem, it's his own fault because he should have just bought a fence. Not wasted probably a lot more money on going to court than he'd spend on a fence. So he's just being punished for his spite. Morton tells him, "Clean the cobwebs out of your ears, you feeble old fossil," and then gets scared and says that he can't control what he's saying, and accuses him of taking bribes, causing him to say that Morton should be taken away. I didn't mention it because it's so obvious, but Morton's the name of a Koopaling, which is a villain, and so is he. I don't know why he was named after Morton, because he's nothing like him. I guess when Sabrina asked if she heard a zap, she wasn't being literal. Or else mortals would hear zaps all the time, and instantly look at the person who used magic. I guess only witches can hear zaps. Why is Sabrina mad at Zelda for saving the day with magic? Then Zelda generates a magnetic wave that erases all the videotape of their appearance on the show. She didn't have to do that. That must have been both an act of mercy for Morton and her not wanting to become famous and embarrassed. I think she's being overly paranoid with that, but I guess it's safer than sorry. She can't risk people realizing that he really couldn't control what he was saying. This issue is by Mike Gallagher. In the first story, Sabrina faces a relatable problem the way a witch can. She sees a speeding trucker and uses her magic to stop him, reasoning that no one would be safe on the street otherwise. So for once she got to be a hero. This probably makes this one of my favorite stories in the comic. First Salem makes the truck run out of gas, but it turns out he was smart enough to have some spare gas with him. So Sabrina uses magic to make the truck sink into the street because of too much cargo, causing unnecessary collateral damage to the city. So it's a good thing we were told that he was wanted in 3 different states, so we know she's not overreacting. It's not like it's the only time he's ever been speeding. So she used her magic to do something good, even if it meant bothering someone. The second story was about Merlin going to Sabrina's high school for fun, being a teenager because he ages backwards somehow. And then he turns into a bird and takes over the high school, turning it into a castle. Sabrina only gets to stop this jerk because she shows him a jar of water, which lets him see a woman he's infatuated with, and he somehow talks into turning everything back to normal, when he could have easily not done that. It's uncomfortable that Newbie doesn't even like him back. She'd be miserable with him. But it was still a pretty memorable story because he was named Merlin in the first place, and he was this big villain who tried to take over Sabrina's high school again. The third story wasn't really a Salem story. Morton summoned Sabrina to court because Salem kept going to his yard, presumably to spite him. He's just doing this to spite them because he's too stubborn to just buy a fence, which even Sabrina lampshaded. So why didn't she zap up a fence a long time ago? This whole plot would have been avoided. The court scene is Zelda having no idea what she's doing as an attorney, and somehow she didn't see that coming. Finally, she brainwashes Morton into enraging the judge. I guess Morton insisted on it being on TV to humiliate Sabrina's family. I hate that the next issue is going to be the final one of the comic, because I love this comic. It's way easier to review than the later Sonic comics. Good thing there's like 2 more Sabrina comics after this. I can't help but think of the story where Enchantra went golfing as the actual finale of the comic, though. I wish that was the last story in the comic, because it involves Enchantra, so it feels more epic than what I'm sure it's going to be an anticlimactic final story.